hear me? I've got my headset on. Am I coming through, Philip?
Yeah, you are
All right.
coming in through.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our first Region 9 States and Islands RCRA Forum. Forum sessions will center around specific RCRA related hot topics in Region 9, where EPA subject matter experts and regional RCRA state and island regulators can come together to share expertise, concerns, and best practices. This forum is part of Region 9 LCARD's commitment to continue strengthening our relationships with and between our Region 9 state and island regulatory partners. Our forum topic today is e-cigarette waste management, which is a rapidly growing issue in communities and particularly in schools. This is a complex issue as it involves both nicotine and lithium-ion battery waste and all the different variations and models of e-cigarettes that contain these wastes. I would like to thank our subject matter experts for making the time to join us today and to share their invaluable expertise. This issue presents many challenges, and we are hopeful that the expertise and information shared here today between EPA and our Region 9 partners can help with understanding and managing this complex issue in your local communities. Thank you for being here. Philip?
Thank you, Claire. All right, so I want to introduce our presenter today, Kristen Fitzgerald. She has a BA in government and a MS in environmental science and policy. She has been working with RCRA for over 30 years, started with EPA in 2001, mostly working on sector-based rulemaking for hazardous waste generators. More recently, she's been working on challenging RCRA waste topics such as solar panels, e-cigarettes, and hand sanitizer. And so it's great to have Kristen here. And with that, I will throw it over to you, Kristen. And Kristen, did you want, Julia has the slides on hand, or did you want to share the slides yourself?
I'd like to share if that's okay.
Yes, definitely. Okay, yeah. So I will kick it over to you.
Made a couple of tweaks since I handed them in.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kristen.
Okay. Is that working for everybody? I'm going to do it in slideshow mode, but it's...
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Okie doke. So I'm actually going to turn off my camera if that's okay. I'm sitting in a room where the lights dim if I don't move around. So every once in a while, I'm going to have like wave my hands, and I figured I'll just turn off my camera and you don't have to witness that. All right. Okay, so good afternoon, good morning to some of you. I saw somebody tuning in from, I think it was the Mariana Islands. Must be very early, so thank you for coming. And thanks very much to Philip for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm honored to be here to talk about the proper disposal of e-cigarettes. If any of you attended last week's ASWAMO meeting in Kansas City, today's presentation very much builds on that one. It expands on it, builds on it. There will be definitely some repetition, but if you're like me, you can definitely benefit from that repetition. So here's a brief outline of what I'll be covering today. I'm going to wrap the presentation focusing on some possible solutions for this problematic waste stream. And then hopefully in the Q&A session, we can continue to do some additional brainstorming together on possible solutions. So at this point, e-cigarettes have been on the market in the US for about 10 years. So we've been through several what they refer to was generations of e-cigarettes, and they come in all sorts of shape and sizes at this point. When they were new, many of them actually looked like cigarettes. You can see that one on the far left there. Those were dubbed cigalikes because they look so much like cigarettes. And the tip even glowed red when you vaped it. And my brother-in-law, who was an early adopter of e-cigarettes, I saw him offered an ashtray in many instances when he was vaping in those early days. But since then, they've evolved a lot, all shapes and sizes. Most of them look nothing like a cigarette anymore. And in fact, here are a couple of the newer types of e-cigarettes that look nothing like cigarettes and are obviously being marketed to our children. The first picture on the left there, that is not, in fact, a series of highlighters. Those are e-cigarettes made to look like highlighters to fool teachers. And the one on the right, as if e-cigarettes weren't addictive enough on their own, some are now paired with video games embedded in them. Another way in which e-cigarettes have become addictive was brought to us by one of the innovations, in quotes here, and lovely innovations in the e-cigarette development that was popularized by Juul. Juul added benzoic acid, and there go the lights, even though I'm waving my hands. Come on. Sorry, give me a second. Apparently waving the hands is not sufficient. Okay. So Juul added benzoic acid to the nicotine, and that turned the nicotine into nicotine salt, and that lowered the pH of that lower pH of the salt made it smoother and easier for non-smokers to vape. And this innovation is credited with enabling the epidemic of youth vaping. I borrowed this slide from a gentleman who was at CDC, who frequently co-presented with me, who was an expert on youth vaping, who sadly is not with CDC anymore. So I'm taking on his role. So Juul was the dominant brand of e-cigarettes among youth for years. Juul cartridge pod, that little tip, that black tip at the end of the Juul, that contains about 0.7 milliliters of e-liquid with about 5% nicotine concentration. And according to Juul Labs, that is roughly equivalent to the nicotine in one pack of cigarettes. Fast forward to today, however, and the dominant style of e-cigarette with youth is much bigger now. So this is a Geek Bar Pulse. There's all different ones, but this is one of the more popular. It's 16 milliliters of e-liquid, also with 5% nicotine. And that's the amount of nicotine in 23 packs of cigarettes. That's more than 2 cartons of cigarettes. So turning to the waste aspect of vaping, in the US, we throw away a lot of vapes. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier, I apologize. I use the term e-cigarette and vape interchangeably. I know, people use them different ways. I just use them interchangeably. So I apologize for not mentioning that sooner. So in the US, we throw away about 4.5 disposable vapes per second. So if you multiply that out, that's 270 per minute, 16,000, over 16,000 per hour, almost 400,000 per day, and almost 150 million per year. That 150 million disposable vapes contain 23.6 tons of lithium that's getting discarded as opposed to recycled. So if you're like me, I have no idea what 23.6 tons looks like. And so thanks to the marvels of Google, I was able to determine that that's roughly equivalent to 2.5 T-Rexes. Somehow that made it more tangible for me. Obviously, I've never seen a T-Rex in real life. Anyway, before turning to RCRA, I'd first like to mention FDA's role in regulating e-cigarettes. So under the 2009 Tobacco Control Act, FDA had the authority to approve e-cigarettes as products. They do this under the PMTA mechanism, the Pre-Market Tobacco Product Application. I can't ever say that acronym without asking myself, where did PMTA come from? It's very confusing. Shouldn't it be PTPA? But anyway, it's PMTA. That's their mechanism. And it's not a trivial process. So only about 3 dozen e-cigarettes or vapes have FDA approval at this point. There's a statutory standard that makes it quite difficult. The applicant has to show that the product is appropriate for the protection of public health. So at this point, only tobacco and menthol flavors have been approved by FDA. None of those fruity flavors that are favored by youth vapors. And FDA has told me that most of those e-cigarettes that have been approved by FDA have removable batteries, which of course makes it much easier to recover and recycle those batteries. That's great. But the problem is, unfortunately, 86% of the e-cigarettes currently on the market are not actually approved by FDA to be marketed in the US. In other words, 86% of the e-cigarettes being sold in the US today are being illegally sold in the US. I had a pretty good guess that was, the ballpark number, but actually somebody's done a study about it and quantified it. So, the problem with most of those illegal e-cigarettes is that they do not have removable batteries. So these illegal e-cigarettes with embedded batteries, they're creating a huge waste problem for us. Which brings us to EPA's role. So EPA, of course, under RCRA has the authority to regulate those e-cigarettes as waste. So FDA does them as products, we do them as waste. I just want to point out though, because a lot of people ask me about this, EPA does not have the authority to institute an extended producer responsibility program for any waste stream, including e-cigarettes. At this point, the closest we come is under the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the bill. They direct EPA and DOE to work together to develop a voluntary EPR framework for batteries. So that's as close as we come to having any authority at all related to EPR federally. So as I'm sure most people in this audience know, e-cigarettes are hazardous for 2 reasons. Right? First, you have the nicotine and acute hazardous waste for toxicity, and that has the hazardous waste code P075. And that's coupled with the lithium-ion batteries, which can catch fire, especially when they're damaged, which makes them likely hazardous waste codes D001 and D003, ignitable and reactive. Case in point, here's a picture of what remains of a van that was carrying 2,000 vapes when it burst into flames on a Connecticut highway. And here's a photo of a MRF where they had to drag the waste outside. It caught fire inside and they had to drag it outside so it didn't catch the whole facility on fire after a lithium-ion battery caught fire and then putting it out. Now, this one might not have been a e-cigarette, but they did attribute it to a lithium battery. So these pictures emphasize for us that e-cigarettes are a very problematic waste stream. And I'm sure you participated in a SWAMO survey, I think it was in the past 6 months or so, where they identified e-cigarettes as a problematic waste stream. And it's for everybody in the whole chain that has to deal with them, right? It's schools, it's household hazardous waste collection programs, it's the transporters, as you could see, right? And the MRFs, the trucks catching fire, the van catching fire, the recyclers, landfills, like they're causing fires in the entire waste chain. And while vapes are not the only source of lithium-ion battery fires, there's a company called Fire Rover. They're a fire detection and suppression company, and they do a lot of data collection on fires of lithium batteries. And they have called the rising number of fires at waste facilities, they call it the vape effect, and they attribute half the fires to vapes at this point. So compounding that problem is the fact that currently we're not aware of any recycler accepting post-consumer e-cigarettes for recycling, which leaves hazardous waste incineration as really the only disposal option. And I do want to, not only talk about the problem, but start to talk about some solutions in this presentation. So I will share some possible solutions, but I do want to note that none of these solutions is what I would refer to as a panacea, right? They're all time and labor intensive, and they're all expensive. So I don't have any like silver bullet for you to make the no magic wand to make it all go away. And ultimately, I think in the long term that the solution is probably not going to come from RCRA. I think the solution probably needs to come upstream in the design and manufacturing of these e-cigarettes, for example, making the batteries removable so that they're more readily recoverable and recyclable. So as I'm going to discuss in the next few pages, the RCRA regulations for the disposal of e-cigarettes vary. But regardless of the regulations that apply to the various types of e-cigarettes and where they come from and whether they're used or unused, I think there are some common goals that we can all have for the disposal of e-cigarettes. And that's keep them out of the municipal waste stream whenever possible. Don't put them in the curbside trash, and recycle the e-cigarettes and the components whenever possible. But don't put them in the curbside recycling bins, right? That's a tough message to give to people. Recycle them, but not in the blue bin, right? You want to get them to specialized recycling or specialized collection so that they can be properly recycled. But that's not the blue bin that people are used to for recycling. What can be confounding about RCRA, and I've worked in it for a long time, is that the same waste can be regulated differently based on where it's generated. So whether the RCRA regulations apply to the disposal of any hazardous waste first depends on where that hazardous waste is generated. All right. Sorry. So a hazardous waste that's generated at a residence is not regulated as a hazardous waste. But if that same waste is generated in a non-residence, it is regulated as a hazardous waste. Likewise, when it comes to recycling, whether those RCRA regulations apply to a material being recycled depends on whether it's unused or used. So an unused CCP in RCRA language, when that's recycled, it's not regulated as a hazardous waste. But when you take that same e-cigarette and the CCP is used, it's considered a spent material, and it is regulated as a hazardous waste when it's recycled. So what does this mean for our disposal and recycling options? I've broken it down into 4 common scenarios that I've encountered. The first one being if the battery is removed, and like I said, most of the time it's not removable, easily removable anymore, not designed to be removed anymore, but for, the jewels that are still out there, the batteries are removable. So if the battery is removed, then that battery can be recycled under universal waste as a universal waste battery. Recyclers will accept them, can easily recycle them. Next category is intact e-cigarettes that are pre-consumer. So let's say retailers that haven't sold them, manufacturers, maybe they're slightly off spec, they're not going to sell them. So they're pre-consumer under RCRA, right? This is a reclaimed commercial chemical product. It's not a solid waste, not a hazardous waste. As far as I know, there's one recycler accepting them currently in the country. And they do a very labor-intensive process. That's the cost is similar to hazardous waste incineration. They disassemble every e-cigarette. They recycle the batteries, universal waste. They recycle the electronic components, although they're very tiny fraction of the waste stream. and they recycle the nicotine. They send it to somebody else who then purifies it some more, and then that gets put back into new e-cigarettes. So like I said, this is, at least they're recycling them. I'm glad to hear that. And they're competitive with hazardous waste incineration, but it's not cheap either to send their pre-consumer e-cigarettes to recycling. So the third scenario is also an intact e-cigarette. Now we're talking about post-consumer e-cigarettes. Let's start with the ones that are generated at a household. Those would be exempt as household hazardous waste. Federally, I recognize that some states are more stringent, California being one of them, but federally they're exempt as household hazardous waste. But again, we don't want those to go in the curbside trash or recycling. We really encourage people to bring those to household hazardous waste collection. I'm not aware of any recycler at this point that is accepting post-consumer e-cigarettes for recycling, but some recyclers are starting to explore this waste stream. So for the time being, they're usually sent to hazardous waste incineration. Now, when you're dealing with a post-consumer e-cigarette, I really think part of the difficulty is, you introduce, what I'm referring to as the yuck factor, right? Like really, like who wants to touch them, like when they've been in somebody's mouth? But it also introduces a certain safety factor, right? There's uncertainty about the condition of the e-cigarette and especially the battery. So I think that's partly what's holding people back from recycling post-consumer e-cigarettes. And then finally, the fourth scenario is intact post-consumer e-cigarettes that aren't generated at a household. Waving my arms again. Okay, so these, because they're post-consumer and they're not household, these are reclaimed spent materials that are solid waste and regulated as hazardous waste. And these in particular, the recyclers have been reluctant to accept them currently, in part because hazardous waste regulations would apply to storage. The recycling would be exempt, but the storage prior to recycling would require a storage permit. Also, if it's unclear whether recyclers want the nicotine mixed in with the black mass that they're generating when they shred the batteries and generate their black mass for sale. They're trying to meet specs usually, and it's unclear, what the nicotine would do to that. So again, these are usually currently sent for hazardous waste incineration. So many of the questions we get about vapes are related to vapes that have been confiscated at schools. And the first question we usually get is, do vapes qualify as household waste? Now, in 1984, we did a response to a petition about household hazardous waste, and we developed 2 criteria as part of that rulemaking for determining whether a waste is considered a household waste. And the first of those criteria is that the waste must be generated by individuals on the premises of a temporary or permanent residence. So based on that preamble language, EPA does not consider a school to be a household, and therefore the e-cigarettes confiscated, collected at a school would not be eligible to use the household hazardous waste exemption. And really, I think that, household hazardous waste would not really go very far in achieving anything in my mind. Because if they were considered household hazardous waste, they'd be allowed to go in the trash. And I don't really think anybody wants that outcome. Slightly better option is that they could go to household hazardous waste collection. But now we're just transferring the cost of the incineration from the schools to the household hazardous waste collection site, probably different parts of the same government, same county or municipal government. So I think it's tempting to want to apply the household hazardous waste exemption to schools, but I really actually don't think it gets you very far in the long run. So the other question we get is, do e-cigarettes qualify as universal waste, either as a battery universal waste or as an e-waste? Think 10 states have e-waste under universal waste. Federally, we don't, but 10 states do. So let me address the battery universal waste question first. Since 1995, when the first universal waste regulations were promulgated, we said in the preamble that embedded batteries may not be managed as universal waste batteries. As far as the e-waste universal waste, we don't have it federally, but we've spoken to the states that do, and those states have said that they do not consider e-cigarettes to be universal waste under their e-waste program. And additionally, the states that don't necessarily have universal waste for e-waste, but have recycling programs for e-waste, they also said that they don't consider e-cigarettes to be e-waste. Obviously, we didn't talk to all the states about this, but all the states that we've spoken to all agreed on this issue. So before we talk about solutions, we do have to discuss RCRA generator categories a little bit here, because the solutions that are available to use are going to be based in large part on the RCRA generator category of the school or small business generating the e-cigarettes. So let's start with the nicotine e-liquids. They're P-listed RCRA hazardous waste, so they have lower thresholds. I will note that you don't have to count the weight of the entire e-cigarette towards that 1 kilogram threshold for acute hazardous waste. You can just count the weight of the e-liquid separately from the rest of the e-cigarette. And I've kind of looked up how much nicotine is in various, e-liquids is in various forms, and done some back of the envelope calculations to figure out how many e-cigarettes does it take to exceed 1 kilogram of acute hazardous waste and be kicked into a large quantity generator status. Now, back when Juul was dominant, they've got less than a milliliter each, as I mentioned earlier. So that takes more than 1,000 joules to get to be an LQG, assuming everyone is full. Every one of those Juul pods is full. But now we've got much bigger e-cigarettes on the market. They've got like 15, 16, 17 milliliters each. Now it only takes like 60 of those style to become a large quantity generator. Or if you're dealing with the e-liquids, in vials, they come in like eye drop vials sometimes. If you're dealing with somebody who's refilling their e-cigarette and they have those vials, let's say they're 5 milliliter vials, sometimes they're bigger, you can have as many as 200 of those before you hit 1 kilogram. Now, most likely it's the nicotine e-liquid that will push a generator to large quantity status way before the lithium batteries would push a generator to SQG status. But just for completeness' sake, let's talk about the lithium batteries and the back of the envelope calculations that I did for those. So how many batteries does it take to exceed 100 kilograms of non-acute hazardous waste to be an SQG? I took, an 18650 lithium ion battery. It's roughly the size. It's a cylindrical battery that's a little bit bigger than a AA battery and is used in some styles, not all styles of e-cigarettes. They're also used in scooters, and even Teslas are entirely based on 18650s. Those are about 50 grams each, and it takes about 2,000 of those to exceed 100 kilograms. So like I said, you're much more likely to exceed LQG status based on the 1 kilogram of the e-liquid than you are of the batteries. I would be remiss if I did not mention that you have to count your other hazardous waste too. You can't only count the e-cigarettes. You have to count all the hazardous waste generated on site during the calendar month to figure out your RCRA generator category. Schools can have lab chemicals. Depending upon the type of school, they can have, auto shops. They can have healthcare waste even. They can have shop waste. They can have cleaning waste, so it's not just the e-cigarettes we're counting towards RCRA generator category, but e-cigarettes are probably one of the more problematic ones because of the nicotine and the 1 kilogram threshold for acute hazardous waste. All right, so now let's talk about possible solutions, albeit these are all within the confines of existing RCRA regulations. So like I said, none of these are a panacea. And these ideas have come from many discussions with state regulators like you, all putting our heads together to find workable solutions. So there are two possible solutions for schools that are VSQGs. And the first one is that EPA encourages VSQGs to contact their local small business collection program to inquire about their policies. These are typically co-located with a household hazardous waste collection program. Ask them, do they collect e-cigarettes? Do they collect the batteries? Unfortunately, unlike household hazardous waste collection, there will likely be a fee, but I strongly suspect it's going to be a better rate than if the school or small business got a vendor on their own. And I just want to highlight one small business collection program in particular that's in Boulder County. They've got a whole branded program that they call Vape Aware, and their website is down below. They're very actively engaged with their schools that are VSQGs, and they have kits that they give to the schools for collecting the vapes at the schools, and then they go back to the schools and pick them up, and then they manage those collected e-cigarettes as hazardous waste on behalf of the school. And they're post-consumer e-cigarettes, so they are sending them to hazardous waste incineration. And I don't know how many schools they're servicing, but I spoke to the woman who runs the program recently, and over a 3-month period in late 24, early 25, she collected 77 5-gallon pails of vapes. That cost her $12,000 for 3 months worth of collection. So as I mentioned, it can be expensive. I will note, though, she got a lower per gallon rate than almost anybody else. And I assume it's because of volume, but also because she happens to live in a state that's pretty close to a hazardous waste incinerator. So the second possible solution for a VSQG is the VSQG to LQG consolidation. That's part of the generator improvements rule and the pharmaceuticals rule. Sometimes I usually refer to it as offsite consolidation, but I noticed at SWAMA last week, most people use the VSQG to LQG consolidation for this, for the terminology for this. It allows VSQGs to consolidate hazardous waste offsite at an LQG. And of course, there are conditions that go along with this that I'm not going to get into all the various conditions. But there were people that were talking about, using a school district, like a central location within the school district that was an LQG already, and then they can consolidate the VSQG waste at that LQG. So can you identify some kind of site, some kind of maintenance facility perhaps within your school district that can operate as that LQG and consolidate stuff from your VSQGs? I will note that based on the limited data that I've been able to collect over the past couple of years, hazardous waste is way cheaper. Hazardous waste incineration is way cheaper per gallon when you incinerate 55-gallon drums versus 5-gallon pails. It's 1/5 of the cost. So I just want to share some of these numbers with you, right? Anytime somebody has thrown out a number at me, I've been writing it down, and I've got enough that I actually kind of assembled some spreadsheets recently. As you can see, the costs do vary wildly, right? From the low end to the high end for cost per 5-gallon pail. But if you average it out per gallon, it's $93 per gallon if you have a 5-gallon pail. But look what happens when you collect it in a 55-gallon drum instead. That high-end cost for a 55-gallon drum, that high-end cost of per gallon is $27. That's lower than the low-end cost per gallon for the 5-gallon pail. And the average gets down to $18 per gallon. That's 1/5 the cost. And if you can figure out a consolidation point for your e-cigarettes, you can save a lot of money. Now, there are also some solutions for schools that, just generate too much hazardous waste, whether it's e-cigarettes that tip them over or they're a big school and they have other waste. There are some potential solutions that could help them as well. One just got recently brought to my attention by Ellie Brown. She's a regulator from Oregon. She said their state has a statewide hazardous waste contract, and the public schools are allowed to access that contract. Obviously, it's going to be way more convenient for the schools to use an existing contract vehicle than to have to navigate that process themselves, come up with the money and the time and the personnel to negotiate the contract themselves. And it's going to be cheaper disposal costs for the school by using that statewide hazardous waste contract because they've got volume. This one could also be used for VSQG. I shouldn't probably just put this only for school that's not a VSQG. The second one is, does your state still have a schools chemical cleanout program? I know, the headquarters program, we used to give out a lot of grants for school chemical cleanout campaign, shut down a while back. Unfortunately, at least one state that I heard of recently, Oswamo, is still running their school chemical cleanout campaign. I don't know if other states have managed to find alternate funding and kept it alive, but if they have, would those programs consider adding e-cigarettes to their program? And then finally, as more of a long-term solution, we're at headquarters, doing a proposed rule for universal waste lithium-ion batteries lithium batteries. And we are looking at the issue of embedded batteries and potentially revisiting that prior interpretation from 1995. Finally, we do have some guidance right now that we put out for proper disposal of e-cigarettes. One guidance, there are two websites, kind of companion websites. One's oriented to individual consumers, and the message is pretty simple. Keep it out of the garbage, keep it out of the curbside recycling, bring it to household hazardous waste management. And the second one is very similar to what I was talking about today, and it's oriented to schools and small businesses. We're also have additional guidance under development. One is a case study of that vaporware program that I just mentioned. It's going to provide additional detail beyond what I discussed today. And then we're also working on a tip sheet or best management practices for e-cigarette collections at kind of non-traditional locations for household hazardous waste collection. And this is definitely something I'd like to discuss with you guys further, how states would view that household hazardous waste collection of e-cigarettes at third parties, like maybe vape stores, instead of or in addition to the traditional household hazardous waste collection sites that, the counties and municipalities run. Because if states don't allow this, basically it's kind of a dead end. But more than one state has brought this to my attention as a possibility. So I know at least some states are considering this as a viable option to collect household hazardous waste. We also have a series of FAQs regarding e-cigarettes that are on the pharmaceuticals rule FAQ page. And this is the list of the questions that are answered. And we're developing an e-cigarette webpage where all these resources that I've mentioned, both new and existing, will be consolidated. And that's it for the presentation portion of today. Thanks. And I guess we'll open it to questions at this point.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen, so much. Yeah, and we'll move on to sort of the open discussion and state and island sharing session of the agenda. But before we did that, I did want to introduce our other subject matter expert, in addition to Kristen, who has joined us today, Don Stilwa, who was a solid and hazardous waste compliance inspector for Pinellas County, Florida, for 15 years. First, started looking into nicotine as a potential regulated hazardous waste in 2014, and since then has really been a subject matter expert in this area, and has gone on to make multiple presentations in front of multiple organizations, including EPA's RCRA Information Network calls. So, Don, I did want to throw it to you first. Maybe you could, give a quick summary of your experience and maybe some of your recent studies that I know have initiated in Pinellas County in your former position. So, Don, are you with us? I saw you on earlier.
We can't hear you. No, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Well, he's playing with technology. Can I just please acknowledge
Yes, please.
that Don is was one of the first people that kind of started educating me about e-cigarettes and shared a ton of really valuable information and pictures and findings from his inspections and so on. And so I'm sad for me that he's retired. Happy for him.
Yeah. So Don recently retired just a few months ago. So congratulations to Don. And uh, Don, whenever you do make it back and able to address the microphone issues, just jump on in and definitely want to hear from you. But until then, I will throw it over to our state partners and state and island partners if they have any questions. I would ask that when you introduce yourselves or when you speak, please introduce yourselves and let us know which organization you're with that you're representing. And we're not, again, as Kristen mentioned, we're not expecting any grand solutions, but really just if you have experiences to share, best practices to share, and even concerns and issues, I think sharing that in this forum is really helpful in itself. So with that, we'll open it up. And Julia will be monitoring the chat if you don't want to come online. And hopefully, Julia, I'm hoping if folks raise their hand, maybe you can call on folks as well. So
Absolutely.
thank you, Julia. All right, I'm not seeing anyone raising their hands or anything in the chat. So maybe I can ask y'all some questions. What if folks could share what are y'all seeing in your local communities, especially in schools? I know our experience this has been an issue that's been flaring up that we've definitely been hearing about from some of our different state partners. It looks like Ed from all the way from CNMI. Thanks for joining us, Ed. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to add, within the CNMI or SIPEN specifically, our vape shops, they have taken the initiative to whenever a client comes in or a customer comes in to purchase new vapes, they actually recycle it. They ask for them to submit their finished vape as they purchase their new ones. That brings me to the question on the number 6. How is a vape shop that is a VSQG regulated under RCRA? Could I just get just a brief answer on that one? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends. If the vape shop is a VSQG, right, then it's technically not regulated under RCRA. We, VSQG waste federally can go to municipal waste, But with this very problematic municipal waste stream, we don't really like to advertise that.
Okay.
And right, we
It's
don't
noted.
want them throwing in the trash because that's where the fires are happening in the municipal waste stream. So we strongly encourage them to find alternative routes. Now, I'm personally very skeptical that that vape shop is actually recycling those e-cigarettes. I would ask them where they're going and how they're being recycled because, like I said, I don't know if anybody who's accepting post-consumer e-cigarettes for recycling at this point. I could be wrong, and I would be happy to be wrong in this regard, but I would be skeptical and I would ask them where they're sending them.
No, you're absolutely correct there. I just asked that just to get a little bit more insight because I plan to visit these shops just to get that answer from them is where they're sending it to. Because right now within Saipan, we do have universal waste recyclers, but because of the issues and the uncertainty with lithium ion batteries, a lot of them here don't wish to store the batteries or even start collecting it just due to that potential risk hazard.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I know our own guidance policy in the preamble says embedded batteries aren't universal waste, but we also know that that doesn't necessarily comport with what's happening in the real world these days. And wouldn't shock me if universal waste handlers are actually taking e-cigarettes as universal waste batteries. We did visit a battery recycler recently, and they do not want to put their e-cigarettes in their recycling process, and they separate them out. So even if they get sent to them perhaps as universal waste, they separate them out and they manage them. Then they send them off for hazardous waste incineration after they separate them out, and they don't put them in their recycling.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's it. That's my question right now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Brianna, if you'd like to go on ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Like she said, my name is Brianna. I work for DTSC here in California. One of the questions that we had when trying to address this issue is there's flavored vapes that are being confiscated. In that scenario, like for your opinion, I guess, who would be considered the generator at that point? Is it the enforcement agency that confiscated the vape pens, or is it the entity that they confiscated the vape pens from? Like, who would be then responsible for managing that generated waste?
We don't have written guidance on this, but my sense, right, is that sorry, I'm getting a really bad echo. But my sense is that the law enforcement, they take it, they're stuck with the hot potato, and they've got to manage it as the hazardous waste now.
Okay, thank you.
I will say an analogous situation that we've heard of for years is retailers. They not infrequently get like midnight dumping in their parking lots. And, it's an unfortunate fact of life for them, right? People just come, they dump it in their parking lot in the middle of the night. Nobody has any idea who left it there, but sometimes what gets dumped is, it turns out, it's a hazardous waste. And the retailer, even though they had nothing to do with the generation whatsoever, gets stuck managing as hazardous waste. TSA is another example. They don't like to use the term confiscate. They collect voluntarily abandoned property, VAP, and at the TSA checkpoints, and they have to manage it as hazardous waste.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
All right. Don has joined us on his phone. So Don, if you wanted to say a few words, please go for it. You're muted though, if just FYI.
Julia, are you able to, in the participant list, try to unmute him on our end? I don't know if that's even possible. Or unmute that number.
I can mute him, but I can't unmute him.
Oh, frustrating.
Don, your Teams account joining is unmuted, but your phone number is muted. Perhaps if you're able to switch that around.
Oh, this is frustrating. Rats.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Even sharing experiences from how y'all are facing these challenges in your local communities, I think would be great.
And I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, one just popped up, but I in the chat. But I have the question about, this issue of third-party collectors for household hazardous waste, and how states would view that, if you would view that favorably, if you'd be open to that. I mean, our idea is, it makes me very nervous personally, having a third party do household hazardous waste collection, because, municipalities and counties that do it, they have an obvious vested interest in keeping that out of the municipal waste stream, right? And so they're obviously not going to go to the trouble and the cost of collecting it and then turn around and put it in the municipal waste stream. But it makes me nervous having a third party do that, because they could, sorry, got to wave my hands here. They could do that. They could collect it and tell people, hey, I'm collecting these e-cigarettes. Look, I'm doing such a good job for the environment, for, such a great service. And that, in theory, like, if nobody's watching and nobody's kind of watching over them, there's no regulations outside of maybe California. There's no regulations that's going to keep them from then turning around and dumping them in their dumpster out back. So that makes me very nervous about it. I know some states are more stringent than the federal government about this, and regulate household hazardous waste either upfront like California, or when it's collected like a handful of other states. It makes me less nervous in those states because there are regulations for it once it's collected. So I don't know if, vape shops, volunteer to do that, what kind of oversight there would be, what kind of maybe solid waste collection regulations there would be. Would they have to come to the state and be like, okay, I'm not regulated for this necessarily, but, would I have to get a permit first because I'm a solid waste collector? Any information along those lines would be really helpful for us.
We have a comment in the chat that I'm going to read real quick, and then Noah will turn to you for a question. Angela Kane from ADEQ says that in Arizona, they've had schools reach out to asking for guidance on what to do with vapes. They are being confiscated.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just like, as young as second grade.
Yeah, vapes are being confiscated from students as young as second grade. AZDEQ is currently in the process of developing a landing page on their website to lead entities to the EPA guidance for schools. They're also developing some handouts for schools to give parents on disposal options. Once all of this is up on the website, they will start a social media campaign and try to work with their Department of Education and Department of Health Services to further spread the word. They are also trying to further develop the recycling locator to help connect people with HHWs that will accept vape waste. That sounds great. Any comments or any other questions for Angela before we move on to Noah's question?
Second grade, I think, is the youngest I've heard so far. That's alarming.
Very. Thank you for sharing, Angela. Noah, if you'd like to go on ahead.
Yeah, hi. I was actually going to respond to what Kristen said about household hazardous waste collection. In our state, the solid waste program requires people to get a permit if they're doing a household hazardous waste collection. I don't know if they actually require them to then dispose of it as hazardous waste. But that would kind of make sense. So that's something I need to look into. And then also in terms of just experiences we've had, I think we're not coping with this very well right now, but we did inspect one high school at the end of 2019 and saw like vapes that were just rolling around in desks in random classrooms. And I actually saw the inspection report. There's a photo where you can see like leaking liquid nicotine that's just like in the little Ziploc bag and like coming out of it. It's bad. And then we recently inspected a school and the inspectors could not find any vapes on their inspection. And they were told that they were being collected by the vice principals, but they went back a couple different times and they couldn't actually locate anyone or any office where they had a collection. So that's a little bit worrying to me because I think the schools, like we basically put them on notice that like this is hazardous waste. Like we've sent them warning letters and now they're like hiding it from us. So we don't know what's really happening. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Yeah, they're either really, really good at, getting a vendor and getting their hazardous waste off site, or they're really good at hiding it.
All right, I have Dawn on my computer. If Dawn, if you're there, if you want to try and chime in here.
Okay, maybe this is going to work. Can you hear me?
Yes, Don, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Little bit of catch up maybe. Florida is extremely unique in that we have got a state mandated SQG program. So all the counties have inspectors, such as what I used to do. We focus on VSQGs and SQGs. So auto repair shops, auto body, some retail, any kind of manufacturing. So I was doing a healthcare facility and noticed a discarded vape pen and a pharmaceutical waste bin. That's what kind of sent me down this rabbit hole. During those first few inspections of vape shops, it was kind of eye-opening. Back in that day, there was a lot of what they call rebuilding going on, where they replace the coils and replace the wicks. And of course, that's pretty much faded out. The deeming rule actually had a lot to do with that because those rebuilders were going to be regarded as manufacturers. So they didn't want any part of that. So they essentially vanished. And I haven't seen that in many years. Prior to my retirement, we inspected a handful of our high schools. We're a pretty big school system in Pinellas County, 140 schools, some odd. And then we met with the administration. And when you inspect schools, there's kind of a three-prong approach. You've got the faculty confiscations, you've got the school resource officers confiscating, and then you've got the custodial staff finding the devices. Generally, what we found is the faculty just keeping it in boxes and in desk drawers, like Noah said. School resource officers, again, that's just going up the evidential chain. And the custodial staff were generally just throwing away the devices. So we still have a lot of coordination and education to do with our school system. So that's kind of my intro. So thanks for the opportunity.
Hey, Don, could you speak? I know you initiated a couple studies at Pinellas County, and I think one of them was involving enforcement agency that may sort of address Brianna's question. Could you speak to a little bit about those studies?
Yeah, again, that's still in progress now. So the Kiana and her staff will hopefully be maybe winding that up within a year. In Pinellas County, we've had some 13, 14, 15 different law enforcement agencies. But a lot of these city agencies were winding up just pooling with the county law enforcement. So when it kind of came right down to it, there were maybe only a handful. And so I don't have the answer to that. We haven't really completed that study, but Kiana and her staff are working on that. Hopefully we'll come up with some results to present to the RIN one day. And then I guess the other quote unquote study we did was post deeming rule and the impacts of the deeming rule on the landscape of the vape shops. In our initial inspections in 2014, 15, 16, 14 and 15, I kind of devised this. There were 5 different tiers or 5 different kinds of vape shops. There was retail only. There was the lounge where they sold the product and then encouraged you to hang around. There were the rebuilders. There were the mixers. And this is extremely crude mixing. Card table in the back room, jug of nicotine, bunch of flavorings, shot glasses, crude plastic syringes, and then the true chemical manufacturers. And so in our initial studies, we had some 52 vape shops. And when we went back post-deeming rule in 2017, about a third of those vape shops had disappeared, but we still had a baseline of 34 vape shops. And I just mentioned in that couple of years, the lounge type vape shop certainly grew robustly. The rebuilders essentially vanished, and the mixers and manufacturing stayed at fairly low numbers.
Thanks, Don. And thank you, Kiana, for for making it work with Don. That's a very creative solution. So thank you for making that happen.
Yeah, no problem. And we started this school project right at the end of last semester, and then obviously Dawn retired, then we went into summer, and now that school started again last week, our team's going to be hitting up some schools again. We're actually currently in discussion with our school board as well, because they're looking to do VSQG to LQG consolidation. So we're in the process of helping getting them to where they need to be and get properly notified and, start following those regulations as well. So we hope to, in the next couple months, have the project on started, wrapped up, and we will be presenting it on the RIN at some point as well. So I think we've done maybe about 10 or 15 schools at this point. So we hope to do a couple more.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
We've got a question from Angela in Arizona. Has any state offered guidance to schools about how to not be a generator? Example, making parents pick up confiscated vapes.
I'll pipe in, not from any experience, just from word of mouth, right? We're throwing out any ideas we hear of and, trying to talk to people about them. And that one has never gained any traction with anybody I've talked to. They're like, it's not realistic, not going to happen. They're not going to come for it. That's usually the feedback I get when I raise it.
This is Don again. Yeah, we had the same reaction from our school administrations, just logistically way too cumbersome. You know, parents picking up cell phones was bad enough, but they weren't going to even broach that for a small vaping device.
Well, and a lot of them aren't attributable to anybody, right? Like John was mentioning, a lot of them are found by custodians. You don't know who they belong to, right? Kids just dump them and run. How do you even get a parent to pick that up, right? If you can't figure out what student it belongs to.
Not kids.
Yeah, I will say, like I said, I'm agnostic about options that are out there, right? Like I just want to hear stuff and we can talk through the pros and cons, right? So things even if you think they're crazy, like, I feel like it's worth talking about it and seeing what, if other people, think it's workable.
Looks like we have
Brianna, if you'd like
Brianna?
to go on ahead.
So an idea that we've been kind of tossing around, because I'm mostly in policy, I'm not doing any inspections or anything like that. A question that we've kind of gotten is there any treatment that can be done to the vape pens once they're received at any kind of collection facilities, as far as like I know that some of them can be pulled apart pretty easily, like the Juuls, but as far as like the different ones, like the Elf bars and the Geek bars, is there anything that can be done at the facility to make it to where they can be treated as separate waste streams? Or is that something that EPA would advise against, just because there's a possibility of breaking the battery?
Well, right now that one recycler is doing that with the pre-consumer e-cigarettes. They've got a couple of advantages with dealing with the pre-consumer e-cigarettes, right? They're not regulated as solid or hazardous waste when they're recycled, but also they get big batches of the same kind of e-cigarette. And so it's a little more predictable, right, about how to take them apart. But they take apart lots of different ones, even with embedded batteries. We just spoke to them recently because I knew that they used to recycle e-cigarettes, but I kind of assumed that they weren't anymore because the batteries aren't removable anymore. And they said, no, we're taking the batteries, we're taking the ones with the embedded batteries, and we figured out, different styles where the batteries are, and we figured out a way to get the batteries out safely. I have never, had eyes on. I'm not an inspector. I'm also in the policy shop, so I've never had eyes on to see, what they're talking about. But they kind of said at least one of the devices anyway is kind of like a guillotine. Like, I don't know, that makes me a little nervous, but if you have the same style and the same size going in over and over and over, you know where the battery is and you know where the nicotine is. So maybe it's not so crazy, but yeah, there definitely is this one company out there that's taking apart the ones that aren't really intended to be taken apart and recycling the various components, but they're not at this point taking post-consumer e-cigarettes. There is one company that's currently exploring post-consumer e-cigarettes pretty aggressively. Hopefully they'll, make it work.
Yeah, I've seen videos of people trying to like open up their vape pens like on their own, and I'm just like, oh, this looks like a mess, because there's like all different kinds of tools they're using. It doesn't look 100% safe. So
Yeah. And the fact that there are so many different shapes and sizes of it makes it that much harder. And
yeah,
as I also mentioned earlier, like the used ones where you don't necessarily know where they've been, what kind of condition they're in, are they damaged? That makes them more dangerous potentially.
yeah.
But obviously there are a lot more post-consumer e-cigarettes out there than there are pre-consumer e-cigarettes out there being thrown away. So hopefully we can solve this problem and get somebody to figure it out. I'd rather have like a dedicated location doing it.
Yeah.
That kind of specializes in this than, a whole bunch of individual consumers being like, ah, sure, I can take this apart. Like,
Absolutely. Thank you.
You'd like to take the floor?
This is for just this is to add on to Brianna's zone. This is Ed Ogle from the CNMI. Is there any way of you doing like water submerging for the vapes after you take it apart to basically de-energize it so that you have less of the combustion effect? Have you ever
yeah,
seen anyone work on that, or?
I've definitely seen people doing that for lithium batteries and definitely heard of that. I don't know if anybody's doing that for e-cigarettes. That's a good question. I can ask recyclers next time I talk to them. Nobody's mentioned it, but that one recycler that we've talked to that's taken apart the pre-consumer ones, he did not mention that, but I've definitely heard people talking about that with respect to, when the lithium battery has been removed, they'll
Yeah,
do that to
separate
discharge
from
it.
the liquids and the vape juice itself.
So
I just wanted to
your
know if
thinking is that they would submerge them before they take them apart?
yeah, or even if the ones that they can't take apart, say just to, I guess, mitigate cost or make things a lot quicker, they could just de-energize it by submerging it in salt water or something to basically not destroy the battery so you make more of a mess, but just to remove the chance or give a higher chance of not combusting during the disposal trips.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good question. I'll see what I can find out about that. Thanks.
Thank you too. And that should be it for me.
Any other questions or comments?
I had a question. Kristen, you mentioned sort of the upstream solution in terms of manufacturing, and I assumed that sort of FDA would take the lead for that potentially, but is there any movement towards requiring e-cigarettes be manufactured in a certain way? So at the post-consumer end, they can be disposed of more easily.
I have had that conversation with FDA. They, first of all, through the PMTA process, they told me that most of the ones that are already approved do have removable batteries. I actually haven't looked at every e-cigarette that's been approved. That's kind of my to-do list, is look at every e-cigarette that's been approved and actually see if that's true, but that's what they told me. But when I said, well, do you have the authority to make the batteries removable? They did not think they had that authority.
Okay.
So the ones that have been approved do mostly have removable batteries, but they didn't think that they thought it would take congressional action to require them to be removable. And there are pros and cons to this. The pro is that it makes them easily removable, easily recyclable, but also there are people out there who like to modify their batteries.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes them more dangerous in some cases. And so it makes them more removable to modify them. And so they're a little nervous about that. Unfortunately, we lost some more very great institutional knowledge at FDA over the past few months. So at least some of my contacts at FDA are no longer there.
Mm-hmm. And how about the you mentioned the large percentage of e-cigarettes that are being sold right now are not FDA approved. Is there any movement in terms of getting those quote unquote illegal e-cigarettes off of store shelves?
Yeah, no, I'm actually really glad you asked that, because my sense is, even before all the enormous cuts at FDA, is that they did not have the resources to deal with that. And the woman that I was speaking to at FDA, she said, like, look, we've got a vape shop right around the corner from our offices, and it's full of illegal vapes, and we know it, and people know it, and like, we could go in there and take them all away, and a week later they'd be right back in business, with a new bunch of e-cigarettes, and they can't do that for every store in the country. So I don't think they have either the will or the resources to make that happen. So, when I tell people, like, look, most e-cigarettes are already illegal, I think there's a little bit of a hesitancy, like, oh, well, the state doesn't need to do anything. They're already illegal. And my answer is, actually, I think the more tools there are, the better, right? Like if FDA doesn't have the resources or the will to enforce their regulations about which ones are legal and which ones aren't, the more tools, state, local, whatever, to throw at this. I've heard states are banning flavors. Well, technically they're kind of already banned because none of them have been approved. But I think, if a state comes up with a law to ban the flavors or make the batteries removable or whatever, like, just throw more kind of tools in the toolkit to help us get to that point of making them removable and getting rid of the flavors that draw in the youth. So I don't think of them as redundant. I think of them as complementary.
Noah?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, there's been a bill introduced in our state legislature several times about banning the flavors. And because we're in the Department of Health and the Tobacco Control Office is also in the Department of Health, we've been working with them. And I talked to them about the disposal problem. And so they've been adding language into the bill to make the stores that are selling the illegal products responsible for the disposal costs that fall on the enforcement agency that confiscates them. The bill hasn't passed yet, but there's a building awareness of the issue. So earlier this year, there's an office within our Department of the Attorney General. I don't know what it's called, but they have a bunch of enforcement people, and they're funded by the tax on tobacco nicotine products. And so they have resources, staff, because that tax money really adds up. And they asked me to come give them a training on how do they manage hazardous waste if they start to confiscate large amounts of vapes, because they're thinking about doing this. I didn't realize that it was such a massive percentage. I'm sure that consumers don't realize it. So yeah, they're like, oh shit, this is a very expensive proposition to start confiscating all of this. We have to figure out how that's going to get paid for. And so I think ultimately, like, it does have to be a legislative solution because it's a very expensive problem. So at least on the state level, we have to go to our state legislature, excuse me, and explain that this has to be funded, because it's the same problem the schools have, is there's no funding. And there was a bill, I don't know how many years ago now, sorry, in our state that I think the Department of Education misinterpreted as mandating them to start confiscating vapes from students. But that's how they interpreted it. And so, there was no funding in that for the waste management problem. But it's something that, we have to tell our colleagues who are like in tobacco control programs and sort of approaching this from other angles, that like, hey, when you're going to the legislature about this ban on flavored things, you need to think about who is funding the waste management end of that when the things are being confiscated. Thanks.
That's a great point. And to tag on to that aspect, one of the states told me recently, I think it was in New Hampshire, that law enforcement had confiscated some e-cigarettes from a vape shop because they hadn't paid the tobacco tax on them. So that's another tool in the toolkit, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be RCRA that's going after this, but I guess there's a lot of tobacco taxes in this country, and I guess the e-cigarettes are subject to those too. And another tool.
right, so we have about 5 minutes remaining, and before we depart, I just did want to let folks know that we are planning to have a similar session in looking at early November, another RSurf session centered around lithium-ion battery. So again, I'll be sending out sort of a planning email, reaching out to our state and island partners if y'all have any questions or areas of interest there. And I'll be reaching out to a few subject matter experts that may be able to speak on the issue. So yeah, I hope you all have found today's session helpful. If you have any feedback, please do send it along my way. We're always looking to improve, and this isn't your last chance to ask any questions about this, because again, we know we're all here in Region 9 together, want to support each other, and that's definitely our goal here. And also, the session's being recorded. We'll send out a follow-up email with the link to the recording and the slides and other resources that we've collected here today. But really hope to hear from all of you, and hope to hear from. Just look out for more future sessions upcoming. So thank you everyone for being part of today, and especially thank you to Kristen and Don for joining us. I think if I'll applaud you, and I'm sure everybody will applaud you, even though they may be on mute. Just thank you so much for your expertise today, and thank you for everyone who chimed in as well from our state and island partners. So,
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.